Welcome back, guys, to Regaining the Balance. Turn my heater off here for you guys. Today we're going to start on a new book, which was actually referenced in the last book we were reading, The Philosophy of Fire. And this one is going to be all about Atlantis. A little bit of Indiana Jones, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I think you guys will enjoy this. This is a different kind of read. Okay, so it's I guess written in the Hermetic tradition here. So let's see here. Oh, we'll take the screen off. There we go. You guys can check that out. All right, so our story of Atlantis, written down for the Hermetic Brotherhood by W.P. Phelon M.D., author of, quote, 3 sevens, quote, healing causes an effect, unquote, quote, love, sex, immortality, unquote, etc. Sounds like he's written some interesting books there. All hermetically based, it seems. So I might have to dig those out too. Check them out. But yeah, take a look at this insignia. Pretty crazy, huh? You got the quaternary, the 4 angels, the 4 wings within the snake eating its tail. There you are. All right, so without further ado, let's just get into it. Okay. It's a little bit bigger for me. Hopefully it still looks good for you guys. It looks good, yeah. What was that? That's strange. Okay, yeah, we're still good. Okay. So, and just to make sure that this view is fine. Forward, yep, okay. Yeah, it's nice and big fat. You guys can read it if you want to as well. Otherwise, this is just another version of our audiobook series. That I'm just gonna, as much as I have time to actually read books out to you guys, I'm gonna do it. At the moment, I'm in between some work, so I have the time. So, forward. It is not necessary for an author in these later days always to be able to say he writes of his own knowledge. This has become a recognized fact. He may write from another's experience, in whose honesty and reliability he has as much and sometimes more confidence than in his own personal sense. This is the case with this little book, treating of a subject of interest to a whole world today. For 6 years I've had the MSS, almost ready for the printer. Now, with the encouragement and helping hand of my dear comrades of the Hermetic Brotherhood, I am bid to let it go forth. May it be a help to the once Atlantean born, wherever they may be. W.P. Phelon M.D. It reminds me of the New Earth and her Sylvia Ivanova in her New Earth channel, in her when the survivors of Atlantis wake up. Hopefully you're listening to this. If you've never heard of this book, Sylvie, I definitely suggest you either check it out yourself or listen to the audios. So we have chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're not going to bother with the names of these. We're just going to get right into it. Okay? Our Story of Atlantis, Chapter 1, The Lost Atlantis. Fair Atlantis, peerless country, lulled with the ocean's arms, lying beautiful and shining far beneath the storm's alarms. Never has a plague come near thee. In thy halls were love and ease. Now above the lost Atlantis roll the ever restless seas. In those histories, half tradition, with their mythical thread of gold, we shall find the name and story of thy cities fair and old. Dreaming bard has told in fancy, wandering minstrel sung of thee. Now above thee, lost Atlantis, roll the ever restless sea. Every heart has such a country, some Atlantis loved and lost, where upon the gleaming sandbars once life's fitful ocean tossed. Mighty cities rose in splendor, love was monarch of that clime. Now above that lost Atlantis rolls the restless sea of time. Happy ye who look backwards from a life of larger scope, deems a youthful idle fancy his lost continent of hope, or by light of love and gladness, find the present home sublime, add that over his Atlantis rolls the restless sea of time. Why is this book written? Is the most pertinent question asked of an author at the outset of composition. It is echoed and re-echoed by critic and reader upon its publication. It certainly appears to be a fair question whenever the subject seems so much out of the routine of ordinary information as the present volume. The scattered records of the past within the historical period would apparently yield scarcely enough material to make a short magazine article of any interest, to say nothing of swelling in size to the dignity of a book. It is now concealed, however, by our wisest scientists that every configuration and corresponding circumstance points to the possibility of the existence of an island continent in the neighborhood, if not directly over the great West Indian archipelago, just as the whole configuration of the North American continent tells the story of the inland sea that broke through its barriers at the Thousand Islands in the St. Lawrence River and hurling itself over the Niagara Falls, left the inhabitable valley of the Mississippi as a legacy to man for future settlement. Excuse me. The sacred writings of all nations concur in the same declaration and statement of disaster to some portion of the earth, most generally included all. In a late issue of Mind appears an article headed, quote, "A Monument to Atlantis," unquote, which says, quote, "A notable discovery of more than ordinary interest for historians, especially those who have leaning towards antiquities, has lately been made by the well-known archaeologist Augustus Le Flongeon. This discovery would particularly attract the attentions of Americans since it enables them to claim to one of the most important monuments of ancient times. The edifice in question is the Pyramid of Xochicalo, hopefully I'm not butchering that, I'm sure I am, standing at 5,396 feet above the level of the sea and situated to the southwest of Cuernavaca, 60 miles from the city of Mexico. Cuernavaca? I don't know. I tried, guys, I tried. For more than a century, the pyramid has been occasionally visited by distinguished travelers, including the learned Humboldt, but none succeeded in discovering the purpose for which the monument has been erected, nor in deciphering the mysterious inscriptions on its sides. As far back as 1866, Dr. Le Flongeon published his alphabetic key to the Maya hieroglyphs, compared this with the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic alphabet. He has now found that the signs on the pyramid of the Xochicalo are both Maya and Egyptian, and the careful study of these decorative inscriptions made it plain to him that the pyramid was a monumental structure erected to commemorate the submergence and destruction of the great land of Mu, Plato's Atlantis, together with its population of 64 million of human beings about 11,500 years ago. Isn't that interesting? That's when they're apparently dating Göbekli Tepe around the same time period. And the supposed thing that hit the earth. Dr. Le Flongeon, in his remarkable work, quote, Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx, unquote, give 4 Maya accounts of the same cataclysm. This, then, is the fifth and, in his own opinion, the most important of all the known records in Maya language of the appalling event that gave rise to the story of a universal deluge that is found in the sacred books of the Jews, the Christians, and the Mohammedans. These records on stone, on sun-dried bricks, on papyrus all tell the same story. The little we know of the Aztecs is also confirmatory of the same fact. Whence came the people of South America with their advanced civilization and traditions of the past? What mighty people built the great cities and temples of the now forest-covered cities of Yucatan and Central America with their carved glyphs and correspondencies to the hieroglyphs of the Valley of the Nile and the East Indian entablatures, and moreover, an almost precisely similar style of architecture to those of Egypt and India. It is reasonable to suppose there was no common bond of fellowship between all these. Is it reasonable to suppose that there is no common bond of fellowship between all of these? The ancient Egyptian ideas have dominated the world down to the present day. Instead of a mummy case, we use a coffin for our dead. The idea is the same. The departed ghost was to be saved the trouble of making a new body, perhaps at short notice, at the great day of the resurrection. The Trinity and unity of God, now universally received, was an Egyptian idea, and the same is wrought into the stone tablets which Le Flongeon, his amiable wife, has unearthed in the forests of Mayas and Quiches. Quiches. If the nation of which these are but the feeble remnants had not disappeared by some cataclysmal climax, we must certainly have had some later historical data, as the mind of the present generation is more largely than ever desirous of truth. The idea of astral presentation and perception may not be without its weight, especially as the books of wisdom of the past declare that automatic books of record are kept of all deeds and manifestations upon the earth. Sounds like the Akashic records, if you ask me. It may be asked why those who have entered into the rest of the unseen should be at all concerned in the unfoldment and development of the race who are ever toiling over the rocky paths of the planet. If the doctrine of reincarnation is true, then would it not be to the interest of the coming egos for all the race of men to be advanced just as far as possible, so that the reincarnated from time to time might receive the highest advantage attainable from their touch with the earth at any particular time? I would ask the same question. Those who are coming back into the present civilization, if they were of advanced and cultured classes of Atlantis and the most ancient Egypt, would find more advantages of acquirement through our leisure and experience when when hurled into life amid the horrors and darkness of the Stone Age. From time to time, the material and data obtained as it hereinafter described, from which this book is made, has been pressed upon my attention as something that would be of use and interest to all who are seeking to know. I do not doubt the authenticity of my information, nor the statements given as facts by those who were so kind and courteous as to make the writer their mouthpiece in this recollection of the ancient memories. I do not doubt that to my readers will come fleeting glimpses of these scenes as if they had been part of them. It is a concealed fact there have never been, since the fall of Atlantis, so many reincarnated Atlanteans upon the earth at the same time as now. This accounts for the almost universal demand out of the astral records for the forgotten knowledge of the occult, which they are recorded. This also explains the readiness of the public mind to receive knowledge of the doctrines of mental healing, spiritualism, theosophy, and occultism in all its branches. Ignatius Donnelly finds a supporter of his Atlantis theory in Sir Daniel Wilson, president of the University of Toronto, who declares after a great deal of search that the lost Atlantis was not a myth, but that it was really a part of the continent of America. He accounts for its disappearance from view in a different way, but that is merely incidental. Donnelly's theory was that the land was submerged by some great volcanic upheaval, and that from those who escaped to the continents of Europe and Asia came the tradition of the deluge. Sir Daniel rejects this explanation as being disproved by the fact that there are no traces of such volcanic action either on the continent or in the ocean bed. He believes that the ancient Egyptians, the most progressive and adventurous people of ancient times, discovered the continent, but that in the decline both of their learning and power, it became lost to view and existed at the time of our knowledge of Egypt begins merely as a shadowy tradition. It is his opinion that traces of the Egyptians of those days are to be sought in the ruined cities of Central America, whose origins have never been determined nor even been made the basis of any reasonable theory. Such a discovery would furnish a substantial basis for the legend of the lost Atlantis, and the theory invests those wonderful ruins with a new interest for antiquarians. The St. Louis Republic said, quote, Atlantis was a continent supposed to have existed at a very early period in the Atlantic Ocean over against the Pillars of Hercules, unquote. Again, the Pillars of Hercules are fire and wind, spirit, and the emanated illusion life, the material, quote unquote, but which was subsequently sunk in a cataclysm of which history gives no record. Plato is the first who gives an account of it, and he's said to have obtained his information from some Egyptian priest with whom he had come in contact. Plato's account says, quote, Atlantis was a continent larger than Asia and Africa put together, and that at its western extremity were islands which afforded easy passage to a large continent lying still beyond. This last mentioned continent being now supposed to be South America, 9,000 years before the time of Plato, according to the tradition. Atlantis was a powerful, thickly settled country which extended its way over Africa and major portions of what is now Europe, even to as far as the Tyrrhenian Sea. Further progress of the invasion of the Atlantids was checked by the combined efforts of the Athenians and other Greeks shortly after the invaders were driven from their continents of Europe and Africa as a great earthquake shook Atlantis from center to circumference. First, the outlying islands sank, then great areas of the mainland. Waves ran mountain high across hundreds of square miles of what had the day before been fertile fields. That sounds like something out of the that book, that the story of Adam and Eve. That's exactly what they talk about, or Velikovsky for that matter. Continuing, great temples were racked and riven, and the affrighted populace climbed upon the ruins to escape the encroaching waters. On the second day, after a night of terrors which no pen could possibly describe, the earthquake shocks were of greatly increased violence, ending only after the entire continent had been engulfed. There is no page in history or tradition that records a more frightful catastrophe, and nothing would be more absorbing interest than a work entirely devoted to giving an account of what is known concerning it. To the objector who urges that the explorers of the world have never discovered any traces of the great city and continent whose story I have endeavored to give in the following pages, permit me to give a few straws floating on our sea of current literature which show that the history of past ages may yet be read in the central part of our continent. Quote, the report that a citizen of the United States has discovered among the mountains of the Mexican state of Sinaloa a long forgotten city tallies with the curious local tradition of the region. Adjoining the state of Sinaloa on the south is the state of Jalisco, and of this state, Guadalajara is the capital. Living in the mountains of Jalisco, part of the great Sierra Madre, or Mother Range, that extends through Sinaloa, and thence northward are the unconquered Yaquis, a brown-haired people with light eyes and almost fair complexions. Guadalajara is the only civilized town that the Yaquis visit, and it has long been believed that the Yaquis' fastness of the Sierra Madre Range conceal not only rich mines of silver, but as well the lost city of the Aztec race. No one has hitherto pierced the mountain wilderness because the naked Yaquis have an effective system of passive resistance that has hitherto successfully closed the sole line of approach. The only human beings other than the Yaquis themselves admitted to the mountains of Jalisco are a few renegade Apaches, murderous wretches, vastly more dangerous to would-be explorers than the peaceful but persistent Yaquis. Unquote. There is no question in the minds of those who have given attention to the subject that the Aztecs are the lineal descendants of the mighty nation of who sought to know beyond the law governing the created. Of the unknown city above mentioned, we add another description from a different source. Quote, during the frequent visits I have made to Mexico, said a mining engineer of Philadelphia to an Inquirer reporter, I have come in contact with many of the Indian residents there and have heard some very singular stories. One which all the Indians unite in telling is that far in the interior exists an enormous city never yet visited by white men. It is described as peopled by a race similar to the ancient Aztecs, who are sun worshippers and offer human sacrifices to their deity. The race is said to be in a high state of civilization, and the Indians say that the city is full of huge structures which are miracles of quaint but beautiful architecture and are situated on broad paved streets far surpassing those of the city of Mexico. One Indian, I recollect, assured me that he had seen the city and its inhabitants with his own eyes, but had been afraid of being captured and had fled. Of course, I did not believe him, but all the same, it is not a little strange that the accounts of the Mexican Indians relative to the mysterious and magnificent interior city agree perfectly. Unquote. There are but of many of the allusions and traditions pointing to the fact that somewhere in the southwest there is a people who undoubtedly hold a complete historical record of the chain of events from Atlantis in its prime down to the present day. While there is perhaps but a single city inhabited and secluded from the outside world of today as keepers of the ancient wisdom, we yet find ruins of such magnitude as to impress us more strongly with the idea that people who builded the original structures could not have wholly disappeared from this continent. The following from San Diego, Cal, we offer in proof, calling attention to the fact that the dragon is a favorite design in the East Indian sculptures. Quote, the ruins of prehistoric city have just been discovered by a party of prospectors from Yuma when the Colorado Desert in search of the Peg Leg mine. The wind had laid bare the walls and remaining of the stone buildings, a distance of 420 feet in length by 260 feet in width. Gigantic pillars, quaintly carved to represent dragons' heads and rattlesnakes, still stood in the sands of the desert, supported on their tops huge slabs of granite weighing many tons. The frieze ornamentation resembled Egyptian sculptures and exhibited a greater degree of skill than is possessed by the Indian artisans of the present day. The fragments of pottery were found underneath the debris, and together with the crumpled piece of frieze we were brought by one of the party to the city. One of his associates came to San Diego, and the others returned to Yuma. nearly 2 weeks ago, but the story of their discovery was carefully guarded in the hope that in some way we might profit by it. The discoverers, in company with 4 others, afterwards went to the desert to explore the ruins. They were driven back by a sandstorm, reaching the city today, but will make a careful examination of the ruins in the season when the conditions are favorable for extensive explorations. From the relics exhibited in it is evident that an important archaeological discovery has been made. Unquote. In connection with the above, there is a peculiarity to be noticed in the occurrence of the sandstorm. It has always been so. A storm or some sudden natural event has warded off efforts to reach these wonderful remains of the prehistoric or even the existing cities. When men shall be ready to seek them, desiring knowledge and not treasure, there is no doubt the keys for unlocking of the mysteries of the past will be given into worthy hands, and what we have herein written will receive ample corroboration. We add still another account of wonderful discovery and proof of the immense population of the old Atlantean kingdom in its prime. This time it is from the city of Mexico, the center of the modern Atlantean or Aztec civilization. Quote, what appears to be the verification of an old Aztec fable of a buried race of cave dwellers in a hidden city in the southwestern Mexico is a matter in which the local scientists are interested in present. L.P. Royal, a French engineer who has lived long in this republic, has just arrived from the wilds of the southwest and reported that he has discovered in the state of Guerrero, a huge natural cave which he believes to be the greatest in Mexico, if not in the world. He says it is much larger than the famous caverns of Cacahuamilpa, situated at some distance south of Guernacava, there you go, which has hitherto been supposed to be the largest natural cave in the existence in Mexico. Monsieur Le Royal, after penetrating the considerable distance into the cave, determined to make a thorough investigation of it, and accordingly, a few days ago, furnished himself with food sufficient for a day, provided himself with lanterns, etc., and set out upon his task alone. As he went along, he made thorough a plan of the cave, but did not anticipate that his task would be so arduous as it proved. At first, the bottom of the cave was a gradual slope downwards, and then changed upwards afterwards alternated for the most part between descents and ascents. Here and there, however, a level bottom of great width was met. The height of the cave varied, as might naturally be expected. In some places it was several hundred feet high. For some distances from the entrance no trace of human beings was found. Occasionally magnificent stalactites and stalagmites, the finest Mr. Le Royal had ever seen, were met with. After proceeding for some hours, he came upon what had evidently been an ancient cemetery, as there were at least 400 petrified bodies, together with ancient idols, etc. There was also a fountain of beautiful clear spring water, which was found to be excellent. Some of the tools, as well as 2 or 3 skulls, M. Le Royal brought away with him, and they are now in the city. The appearance of this charnel house, thus lighted up for the first time for hundreds of years, was gruesome in the extreme, and well calculated to shake the nerves of the explorer. Monsieur La Royale continued his explorations while hour after hour passed. It was not until after he had traveled a distance of at least 21½ leagues that he thought it time to call a halt and proceed on his return journey. So far as he could see, the distance still to be traversed might be very considerable, with the chances for the cave opening out, as the floor seemed to be well trodden by human feet. He retraced his steps as speedily as possible, and after being underground for upwards of 24 hours, found himself once more at the entrance of the cave. Mr. Le Royal promised to make further explorations before long. It is expected that a party fully equipped for the exploration of this wonderful cavern of the dead will soon be fitted out under the guidance of the discoverer, and the outcome of the investigations will be awaited with earnest. The natives of the locality, as, in fact, the Indian population in general in Mexico, believe that at some place near the southwestern coast of Mexico there exists a great white city with countless treasures which has never been seen by white men, an approach to which is so intricate and cleverly concealed that a stranger has never entered its solitary precincts. Unquote. With all the increasing mass of information on the subject, it seems there should be some effort at a collection under guidance of what is known about Atlantis the Mighty, to make a beginning and thus call attention in this direction is my answer to the question, why is this book written? Okay, I just need to wet my whistle. Looks like another poem. Atlantean memories. Out of the dim past, old memories come to me, from where the light in all its glory seemed to be, as the people worshipped near the sun's resplendent rays, and lotus crowned hailed with joy the festal days. Golden lyres sending forth rich, harmonious strains, sounding the keynote which over the world still reigned. High above all, the vestal's song enchanted soars, mingling with the ripples on the wave washed shores. From the temple floats the bells' melodious chimes, and so deep and mellow in that old Atlantean time. Throughout the ages linger these old memories still, and hover round me with no effort of my will. Still in my heart is throbbing with the rhythm of the waves, those slumbering waves which alas became our graves. Again I hear the glad hosannas to the sun arise. Isis in the sanctuary is veiled from human eyes, which read no warning in the sky's celestial hue, nor heard it murmured in the ocean's calm and blue. Neither listen to the worship neither listen to the whispering wind so free, telling of the doom of fair Atlantis was to see. I am thankful that the gates of memory ope, that the great angels weave the scattered threads of hope, and clothe us freshly with its robes of snowy white, while on our altar shines again the mystic light. The radiant star which once over Egypt shone glimmers once again with a message all its own. Humble though the temple, the melody is there, the bell's sweet chiming breaks upon the silent air. Amid the incense rising from our sacred shrine, old Atlantean glories round our spirits twine. Chapter 2. There is yet a little more of the flotsam and jetsam upon the stormy waves of the human unfoldment, which is supplemental to our opening chapter, and must be detailed now, or put entirely to one side. From two distinct sources, we give an account of an old Mexican city that has never been entered by foot of a white man, and which was known to be in existence long before the Spanish conquest. Quote, Mr. Juan Alvarez, who was just returned from an exploring expedition in the southwestern part of the Republic, reports that he has found a city which has never been entered by a white man and which has evidently been in existence for hundreds of years, going back before the time of the conquest of the country by the Spaniards. It is an old Aztec city, and the approaches to it are so guarded by nature that it is an impossibility to reach it if the inhabitants do not want a traveler to get in. The city lies in almost inaccessible mountains in the extreme southwestern part of the country and is so far away from civilization that few white men have ever been in the neighborhood. It was by the purest accident that Alvarez came aware that the city was anywhere in the vicinity, and after he found it, all of his endeavors to reach it were unavailing on account of the persistent opposition of the natives. He had been traveling over the mountains in search of an outlet to the Pacific Ocean when he came to the top of an elevated plateau and crossed to the further edge. He had a magnificent view, and while looking over the country saw what he took to be houses in a far distant valley. A close inspection with a glass convinced him that what he saw was really a collection of houses, and he at once set about reaching the place to see who lived in that part of the country. After days of hard work climbing over cliffs and mountains, he reached a point from which he obtained a good view of the city and saw that it was regularly laid out in streets and was peopled with a race who knew something about civilization. The houses were of stone and were surrounded by yards, in which were growing flowers and shrubs. On all sides were evidences of taste shown by the inhabitants, and it was evident that he had found a city which was not known to the outside world. Quote, oh, it's still the same quote. A careful examination of the country showed him that the city was located with a natural amphitheater and was accessible from one side only. He saw that the only means of access was through a long and narrow defile which led into the mountains from the Pacific coast side, and he started to reach the place where he could find his entrance. He made an outline drawing of the city as it appeared to him from the distant mountain top, and this is all he has to show that there is a city within the heart of the mountains, for he was never allowed to reach the spot. From this drawing it is plain that the city has not less than 4,000 inhabitants. The houses were all of stone and are supplied with doors and windows. In the center was a large building which was undoubtedly the temple of worship, for on its walls could be seen sculpture design representing the deity. It was in the shape of the ancient Tiakali, which are to be found in many parts of this country, and the people could be passing in and out of it during all hours of the day. After 10 days' arduous work, Alvarez found himself at the foot of the mountains of the western slope and set about searching for the canyon leading to the city. He had so well marked the lay of the land that he had no difficulty in finding the entrance, but he was met by a band of Indians who refused to let him proceed. They offered him no violence, but insisted that he should return. He told them that he had come over the mountains and did not know how to find his way back. After reconciliation, he was told he would have to remain a while as a prisoner, and 2 runners were sent into the mountains who returned in a day with orders from someone in authority, and Alvarez was blindfolded and placed on the back of a mule. He traveled in this condition for 3 days, only having the bandage removed from his eyes at night. On the fourth day, he was told to remove his bandage, and when he did so, he found himself on the borders of the Pacific Ocean. The Indians had gone, leaving him with nothing to guide him back to the place where he had seen the city. Unquote. This city is described in full in, quote, Future Rulers of America, unquote, and has been visited by persons in the body who have been permitted to do so. We conclude our extracts with a description of another mighty city, the work of the powerful nation whose capital, located in the great island of Atlantis, exercises power both east and west, of which we are trying to tell. Quote, the American archaeologists who went to the recently discovered city in the Sierra Madre Mountains have returned and tell of another hidden city 5 Spanish leagues north of the first city. The leader of the party, C.W. Panteon of Philadelphia, says these cities were evidently twin capitals of a wealthy district long before the Aztecs appeared. The two cities are connected by underground passages. Whoa! Hewn out of the solid rock, and it was while exploring one of these passages that the second was discovered. It lies in a deep basin of the mountains with no exit except the underground tunnel. At least none has been found. To that which we have thus drawn from all accessible sources and the visible, I now desire to add supplementary testimony from the astral records, which I believe to be reliable and worthy of credence. Does not this collated evidence of the similarity in nature and civilization west of the great city, which could not possibly have led commerce with the mother country for centuries, prove conclusively, even to the realistic and scientific mind, a common origin for religions, teachings, customs, languages of both oral and written? All discoveries relative to this subject confirm this conclusion. We are indebted to those who are impelled by an irresistible desire to learn, know, who in this cause are willing to expatriate themselves, endure danger, and overcome obstructing difficulties, if they may but by some chance guidance bring again to the light of day some of the various records which were left when the sun of the manifested spiritual world went down into the shuddering earth? To the Aryan people who listen with a willing heart, there is much that can be given concerning this ancient city. It matters little how science and religion shall accept that which is offered, whether in a scientific way or from the unseen, as true and of value. Science and religion have never received anything new upon untried lines of thought until they have been forced to the exception. That is a very cogent point. That is why the priests of all ages are so conservative and have withheld so much more than they should, even on their conservative line of thought. It has ever been their rule to hold fast upon that of which they had become possessed, content and satisfied without the trouble and exertion of seeking new fields for themselves, or admitting the possibility of broadening truth for others. All that has ever been learned to distinguish the savage from the civilization was known to the wise men of Atlantis. Whenever there has been upon the earth a sufficient number of Atlanteans at one time to control a nation or to form one by themselves, that nation or epoch has always experienced a most wonderful growth. In the days of the last Egyptian splendor, when it was the school to which Greeks and Romans resorted for instruction, was the last time noted in history of such a pre-appearance or reappearance in sufficient numbers to admit of a national control. What they did, we have the pyramids, the temple of Karnak, and all the mighty ruins of the Nile and the Euphrates in evidence. As soon as the Anglo-Saxon speaking races were sufficiently developed out of savagery, the Atlanteans commenced reappearing, startling the whole world ever on and anon with their great strides towards wisdom and knowledge, as they slowly paved the way by conquest and discovery for settlement and reoccupation of that which belonged to them, and for the utilization of all their old resources under new conditions of added strength and expertise. In no other way can we account for the wilting and extermination of the redskin usurpers who had neither claim nor strength to maintain title to that in which they had strayed by accident during the temporary absence of the real owners. Holy shit. Oh, wow. Well, that's interesting to say the least. And it makes me wonder whether or not this guy here is um, referring to. I mean, this is. You got to remember, this was published in 1903. So the last 60 years was really when things really got bad for the Native Americans. I mean, before then too, but the last, like right before the Civil War and after, especially after the Civil War, when you have the Trail of Tears and the whole real theft of everything, like you gotta wonder if this guy is, writing from some of the same sort of people that sort of created this idea of manifest destiny. Because because that's what that just sounded like. That sounded like manifest destiny, right? And they're looking, and these like quote unquote Americans who consider themselves quote unquote Atlanteans um, consider it stolen and usurped by the red-skinned. What? That says a lot. But anyways, I digress. Isn't that interesting? Um, Much sympathy has been wasted on the red son of the forest. Ugh, Jesus, but has been obeyed, but has but obeyed the he has but obeyed the law. Who cannot dominate the resources of the environment must yield title to him who can. How much would our vast storehouses of mineral and agricultural wealth have helped man's unfoldment if they had never been used? The difference between the American Indian and the Anglo-Saxon Atlantean is plain to the dullest intellect. Yeah. I'm going to continue reading this because it's just the context of this book. But yeah, I think this guy's definitely missing some perspective here. And it's not very hermetic if he's writing this as the Hermetic Brotherhood. When you really understand what the Hermeticism is talking about, it doesn't exclude anybody. So this is kind of got a little bit of racist overtones in this book here. As the city of Atlantis grew, her population was drawn off into colonies which had deep in and also, like, it's funny how they also mention like the Anglo-Saxons. So the British Empire is also part of this Atlantean, empire, so to speak. Um, as Atlantis city, as the city of Atlantis grew, her population was drawn off into colonies which had deep and abiding influence on the whole of the Western continent, but especially centering along the belt in which Atlantis itself was located. Between the fading away of the last Egyptian civilizations and the concealment of the world's records of that time, there is a mysterious gap which can be accounted for only in one way. With Atlantis, when it was in its prime, there were other units in the world's category of nations which were not so far advanced. If Atlantis had held on in the even tenor of her way, all other nations of the world would have received the light and been lifted to something near its own standpoint. But when this chance of development was cut off, they had groped in comparative darkness. When this class of people incarnated again in force of numbers, such scenes as the conquest of Rome by the Goths and the Vandals, the overrunning of Europe by the Huns, and the eruption of the Tartars, times without number occurred. Interesting, huh? When this class of people incarnated again in force of numbers, such scenes as the conquest of Rome by the Goths and the Vandals, the overrunning of Europe by the Huns, and the eruption of the Tartars came without number occurred. As they disappeared from the mortal vision, we can but recognize their sameness of purpose and the most pertinent fact that undone duty made all this trouble for the Atlanteans of the far past and their comrades and associates. Have we learned the lesson that no human being is separate from ourselves? A wrong once done must be righted. It is the eternal law of exact justice. Well, isn't that strange from this other sentence about the usurping? Okay, well, whatever. Continuing. As these misbegotten impedimenta to progress, okay, as these misbegotten impedimenta to progress pass out into the unseen, having overborne or put off all heads that towered above their own, intellectually Atlantean influence revives. Little by little have these, quote, fellows of ignorance, unquote, felt the uplifting of influence of the, quote, sons of light, unquote. And every generation increased the widening wave of educated and spiritualized people, which must finally include within it every nation, tongue, or people of the earth's full complement of inhabitants. The American nation has done a vast deal for the enlightenment of the whole world. Thus, it is easy to understand why the extinguishing power of all that holds the soul in chains is projected towards us. I don't know what that means. In the ancient times, when the lamp of civilization burned at Rome and Athens, or later as at Antioch and other cities, single centers of learning blazed out and lessened the darkness as do beacon lights set on a hill. But with these compare the events of today. A compact, unified nationality which resembles the old Atlantis had its beginning on an island, cut off from easy approach, yet has been able to make its power felt throughout the whole world. And although the English name be detested, its power is always respected. Not only has this nation made itself felt everywhere, but it is the founder of the American nation and unites its force with that to push the common civilization and thought currents into every part of the globe. Sounds a little creepy. The freedom of the thought body and the aptitude of the mind engendered thereby has once more drawn to the American continent more Atlanteans than there were ever incarnated at one time since the fall of that city. It thus happens that their inventions and knowledge and wisdom and the results of thought force modified and perfected by the assimilation of hundreds of years of devacanic rest. Devacanic. All right, yeah, I'll try. I tried. Perfected by assimilating the hundreds of years, and Deva Kanik rest is coming upon the nation in a flood, as with outstretched hands they demand from the silence that which they themselves deposited in the astral records long ages since. We often wonder at the events transpiring in the ways of discoveries or at the application of principles which are perfectly logical and linked one upon another. We have surely reached a point and begun to guess about the uses and methods of application of the vehicle of force, about which the Atlanteans knew much, and desiring to know more, found there was a limit which barred their further progress. We already have a hold upon another, and we desired only that they who may essay to advance in may essay to advance in this direction may do so with body, soul, and mind so purified they will not need the reprimand of obstruction that came to the original investigator of our nation on that line. The reason this age is so celebrated above others in the near past is due to the fact thus stated. We perceive in the near future, as has been repeatedly foretold, the end of a cycle is at hand. The cataclysmic results, the sinking of land in some places and the rising in others, is imminent. When cities peculiarly when cities peculiarly situated are crowned with inhabitants who have lost all conception of everything but their own desires, centered in selfish purpose, their thought vibrations became inharmonious with the universal thought vibrations. In this inharmony continues strong enough to communicate itself to the ground upon which the city stands, this foundation being subject also to a set of vibration upon the natural plane of liquidity. Serious consequences may occur. That's interesting. So causing liquefaction by the mind, or by mass mind. Just what the outcome of the present period will be none but the council of the seven great builders know. But this we have gathered, that within 100 years, and possibly much shorter time, Atlantis will be above the waves. Whatever her mountain monuments contain, or whatever may be in her ruined temple, can then be investigated. Within 500 years, the bulk of the population will be south of the equator. That which is now sea will become dry land, and the old continent of Lemuria will once more sustain its millions of inhabitants. Scientists tell us that the time is fixed when all the gold, silver, and coal will be mined. How short-sighted! Under the sea is 1,000-fold more than has ever been brought to light by man's busy hands. Ooh. Now, that was a very interesting start, chapter 1 and 2. It's very weird because like he has like I don't know. It's you gotta have to look at I think maybe this book as being an interesting example of the way as the way people can be where they have these strange ideas and these strange moments of clarity but also strange like racist ideas that are either part of their current ideology or their upbringing or whatever. I think that there are certainly things that this guy has no clue about when it comes to Native Americans. And if he did, he probably wouldn't say the things that he did. And I'm going to be bringing you guys a whole nother book, which is very fascinating. And it's going to talk about some of the very connective things with the founding fathers of the country, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and what was also known as the Iroquois Confederation, and the way that thing was all set up. Because that also has a lot to do with this guy's talking about with Atlantis, and also with what with the previous book we read called The Philosophy of Fire, and when I bring that out, it'll be clear. But it's clear that this guy has his own little preconceived notions of things. Anyways, I need to take a quick break to go throw a log of wood in my stove, go get a drink, go use the bathroom, all that good stuff, and I will be back. Looks like we're back. Turn that off. Turn that off. And here we go. Chapter 2. In the early 70s, 1870s, having by constant and severe attention to business reached a point when rest and change were imperative, I was advised by my physician to take a sea voyage. I mentioned this fact to a friend of mine in New York City who was a vessel owner. He offered me the position of a supercargo in one of his vessels about to sail for San Francisco, around the Horn. I gladly accepted the chance, for it gave me both motive and occupation for the trip. My preparations were made rapidly. We sailed out of New York Harbor on the 15th of June, 1872. As the last lighthouse sank slowly beneath the waves and the full moon rose in the heavens, I stood watching the receding landmarks, little dreaming of the momentous events to happen as part of the voyage, nor the marvelous revealings to come to my knowledge, before I again touch my foot upon the land. Excuse me. Of all these, the following pages are but a feeble portrayal, but it is always so in life. We meet and part, come and go. The consequence of the meeting and the pain of the parting may be inexpressible in spoken language, but how shall we know? Who will tell or warn us of the swiftly oncoming future with its burden or weal or woe? As our vessel was devoted to freight, we, as I knew, carried but a single passenger who, by a special favor of the owner, had been permitted to occupy the one spare cabin. The rest of the space was occupied by the officers of the ship, including myself. I had been introduced to this man when he had first come on board, but being much preconcerned about the business I had in hand at the moment, I had simply responded with the usual meaningless phrase of, quote, happy to make your acquaintance, unquote. But I remembered afterwards an impression of dignity, of bearing, of sweetness, of real courtesy on his part. And that particular indescribable thrill as we shook hands, which once or twice in a lifetime it may be our good fortune to experience, as the line of our lives cross with those who are essential to our highest and best unfolding. Standing thus, leaning meditatively over the taffrail, I came back to myself by hearing my name pronounced distinctly in a low, musical voice with just the slightest foreign accent. Looking around, I acknowledged the address as he went on to say, quote, I see you are leaving part of yourself behind you, unquote. Oh, not a large part, I replied, but I was thinking about the certainty of parting and the uncertainty of meeting. Don't you think that we part forever from our friends, only when we have accomplished or finished all that we can do for each other? So long as our work remains undone, we shall certainly meet again. Yes, I said, that may be so, but it is the human unconcernity that saddens. Unquote. Looking full at this man to whom his every word I was most indescribably attracted, I saw a picture from that time indelibly stamped upon my memory. Tall and almost perfectly proportioned, black eyes, while in their ordinarily kind expression one might easily imagine their possibilities, when honest indignation or righteous anger stirred their depths. Hair and beard white and worn a little longer than custom prescribed, his bearing was majestic in strength, serene in harmony, attractive beyond compare in its unselfish desire for the good of others. With all this, there was an impression in all he said. He could tell very much more if he only would, about any subject concerning which he might be conversing. It was such a face as children love and scoundrels hate, containing within itself the pitying tenderness of a mother's love and a father's sustaining watchfulness. In our interview, I passed from the outermost border of casual acquaintance to the confident championship of sworn friendship. At this, too, I have marveled, for I am slow to perceive or offer friendship, but come slowly to the perception of what might be in those who honor me with their goodwill. Although we stood some little time together, gazing upon the ocean as the night and waters met in closer and still closer embrace, we lapsed into silence with that strange feeling of being company for each other, although no word was said, and finally we descended into our respective cabins for the night. As is usual with the position I held, my duties during the voyage were almost nominal, making up for this leisure, however, during the receiving or discharging of the cargo or any part. Consequently, I had sufficient time to improve the acquaintance so curiously begun. It did not take long to find out that my friend was a zealous, unremitting student, and while we were familiar with many lines of common interest, There were others in which he was well versed, of which I knew comparatively nothing. He was a very eloquent and instructive talker, and readily and gladly answered my questions. Especially was this true of things in the past, which the present generation has moved on and forgotten, and a peculiarity of his descriptions was that they were given as if personal experiences of his own. Later I knew why, but at the first it seemed that it was done to give more life and movement to the story. As a child I'd always been fascinated with whatever I had chanced upon, either in reading or conversation which related to Atlantis. But as I grew older, enveloped in the materialistic ideas of the modern schools, I had come to regard the little that was known of the ancient mistress of the seas as largely fabulous, if not wholly unworthy of credence. After we had been out from port 4 or 5 days, as we sat chatting on the quarter-deck, something was said which induced me to ask him a question squarely. Quote, "Do you believe there were ever such a country as Atlantis?" "Most certainly," was his quiet, decisive answer. "But do you not think it possible that a whole continent could disappear so utterly beneath the waves as that is said to have done, leaving no more trace of its former existence than has been the case with that? And why does this seem impossible to you?" He answered. Does history know anything of the city that stood under ancient Troy? Who knows who the builders or what the design of the pyramid of Egypt? Who can tell the cities lying strata upon strata in the valley of the Nile? In your own country, who can tell anything of the mound builders? What does the world know of Palmyra, of Babylon, or of the great cities in the valleys of the Euphrates? But for the accessibility of their ruins, they would by this time have been as thoroughly forgotten as Atlantis now is. And here his face softened with an infinite pity. Perhaps within 40 years from now we may have another lesson in the opportunity for denying the existence of the past. But maybe, he continued, you would like to hear some of the actual records brought down even to your day of an event that concerns so intimately every living person now upon our planet. Unquote. Upon my eager assent, we went into his cabin and soon returned with a small black letter volume, written after the style of the Far East, upon parchment from right to left. Opening it, he read in his sweetly modulated tones, translating as he read, the following extract, quote, "Facing the Pillars of Hercules was an island larger than Africa and Europe put together. Beside this main island there were many other smaller ones, so that it was easy to cross from one to another as far as the further continent. This land was indeed a continent, and the sea was the real ocean in comparison to the quote-unquote the sea of the Greeks was but a bay with a narrow mouth." Pardon me. In the Atlantic island, a powerful federation of kings was formed, who subdued the larger island itself and many of the smaller islands, and also parts of the further continent. They also reduced Africa within the straits as far as Egypt, and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. Further aggression, however, was stopped by the heroic action of the then inhabitants of Africa, who, taking the lead of the oppressed states, finally secured liberty to all who dwelt within the Pillars of Hercules. Subsequently, both races were destroyed by mighty cataclysms which brought destruction in a single day and night. The natural features of the Attic land were entirely changed, and the Atlantic island sank bodily beneath the waves. In the center of the Atlantic island was a fair and beautiful plain. In the center of this plain, and nearly 6 miles from its confines, was a low range of hills. Here dwelt for many generations the renowned race of the Atlan, from whom the whole island and sea were named Atlantic or Atlantis. The ruling kings ever handed down the succession of power to their eldest sons, the younger sons going into priesthood. They were possessed of such wealth as no dynasty ever obtained or will easily procure hereafter. This wealth was drawn both from all foreign nations with whom the Atlanteans traded and from Atlantis itself, which was especially rich in minerals and possessed the only known mines of orichalcum in the world, a mineral with most wonderful and inexhaustible properties, a metal which was then second only to gold in its value. Quote, "The country was so rich in timber and pasturage, moreover, there were vast numbers of elephants, spices, gums, and odorous plants of every description, flowers, fruit trees, and vegetables of all kinds, and many other luxurious products, which this wonderful continent, owing to its beneficent climate, brought forth. These were sacred, beautiful, and curious, infinite in number. Nor were the inhabitants content with simply the natural advantage of their glorious country, but also displayed a marvelous industry and skill in engineering and constructive arts. For in the center of the island they built a royal palace, every succeeding king trying to surpass his predecessor in adoring and adding to the building so that it struck all beholders with the greatest admiration. They cut about the royal palace a series of waterways or canals. These were bridged over at intervals, while an immense canal admitted the largest vessels from the seas, giving at once the protection as a harbor and making it more convenient for the transportation of freight to and from the interior. In fashioning their interior streams, they left docks cut out of solid rocks where their triremes could land their cargoes. The stone used in their buildings was of three colors, white, black, and red, so that many of the buildings presented a gay appearance. Their walls were covered with brass, which they used like plaster, tin, and orichalcum, which had a glittering appearance. Northeast of the center of the continent stood the great temple. The interior was covered with silver except the pediments and pinnacles, which were lined with gold. Within the roof was a magnificent mosaic of gold, ivory, and orichalcum, and all walls, pillars, and pavements were covered with orichalcum. By a system of aqueducts leading from natural springs of hot and cold water, they had supplies for baths and for irrigation of their beautiful plantations and gardens. The docks were filled with shipping and naval stores of every description known to man at the time. The whole city teemed with dense population. The main canal and largest harbor were crowded with merchant shipping for returning from home, or turning from, or making ready to sail for, all parts of the world. The din and the tumult of their commerce continued all day long and the night through as well. Such is the general sketch of their wonderful city. Now, as regards the rest of the country, it was very mountainous, with exceedingly precipitous coasts, and the plain surrounding the city was itself environed by a mountain chain broken only at the sea entrance. The plain was smooth and level and of oblong shape, lying north and south. The mountains were said to be the grandest in the world for their number, size, and beauty. The whole country was a constant succession of prosperous and wealthy villages, for there was an abundance of rivers and lakes, meadows, and pastures for all kinds of cattle and quantities of timber. They surrounded this plain with an enormous canal or dike 100 feet deep, 606 feet broad, and 1,250 miles in length. But by it the water from the mountains was conducted around the whole plain, and while a part flowed out to the sea, the rest was husbanded for irrigation. They were able, by raising 2 crops a year, to double their productivity. They were able to double their productive capacity. I need another drink here. In the polity of the Atlanteans, the kings maintained an autocracy, and the priesthood were their council of consultation in all matters of state, until at last the power passed into the hands of the priesthood. For many generations, the rulers, king and priest, remained obedient to their ancestral traditions, for they possessed true and altogether lofty ideas and exercised mildness and practical wisdom, both in ordinary vicissitudes of life in their mutual relations. They looked above everything except virtue. They considered things present of small importance and contentedly bore their weight of riches as a burden. Nor were they intoxicated with luxury, but clearly perceived that wealth and possessions are increased by mutual friendship and practice of true virtue. Whereas, by a too anxious pursuit of riches, the possession themselves are corrupted, and friendships also perishes therewith. Thus it was they reached the great height of prosperity we have described. But when at last their mortal natures began seeking to dominate and override the divine within and about them, they commenced to display unbecoming conduct and to degenerate, thus blighting and finally destroying the fairest of their most valuable possessions. This, said my friend, is as authentic an account as that of any nation of whom we have any history, for it was handed down from father to son in ancient Atlantean writing, which was perfected about 25,000 years before the Christian era commenced. Unquote. Just then some duty claimed my immediate attention. As he rose up to return to his cabin, he looked me fully in the face and remarked, quote, "If I mistake not, the time is close at hand when your desire for information on these lines will be more fully gratified." Unquote. Chapter 4. It was a day or two before we had a chance for any more conversation, for he seemed to be very busy in his own cabin with what looked like an ancient map and a number of diagrams or Kabbalistic calculations, which I fully recognized, for I had some experience with researchers along that line and could, to a certain extent, verify some of the simpler rules of deductions from the Kabbalah. But as I could see, the operations which he was engaged were very complex and far-reaching and concerned some of the mightiest secrets of planetary creation. I also noticed while the problem seemed very abstruse and complicated, he did not seem at a loss in any sense or puzzled, his absorption being the result rather of the length of the process. At last he appeared to have reached a favorable conclusion, and his data memoranda were put away. Once more he came upon deck, although for a few days he apparently put aside a continuation of his former talk about Atlantis, yet there was an uplifted expression of content, lending an added charm to the ever-restful dignity of the perfect face. While he had been thus busy, it had occurred to me that I had an odd volume in my locker I had picked up in the second-hand stall in Boston, intending to examine it at my leisure. Now having my interest aroused, I brought it out and found among much that was quite discursive the following pertinent paragraphs. Quote, "The fourth continent, which it has been agreed to call Atlantis, was formed by the coalescence of many islands and peninsulas that were upheaved in the ordinary course of evolution and became ultimately the true home of the great race known as the Atlanteans, a race developed from a nucleus of northern Lemurians, centered, generally speaking, towards a point of land in what is now the mid-Atlantic Ocean. In connection with the continent of Atlantis, we should bear in mind that the account which has come down to us, the old Greek writers, contains a confusion of statements, some of them referring to the great continent as a whole, and others to the last small island of Poseidonis. Plato, for instance, condensed the whole history of the continent of Atlantis, covering several million years, into an event he located upon the island of Poseidonis, about as large as Ireland, whereas the priests spoke always of Atlantis as a continent as large as Europe and Africa put together. Homer speaks of the Atlantes and their island. The Atlantes and the Atlantides of mythology are based upon the Atlantes and Atlantides of history. The story of Atlas gives clearly to us the clue. Atlas is the personification of the single symbol of the combined continents of Lemuria and Atlantis. The poets attribute to Atlas as to be Proteus, of superior wisdom and universal knowledge, and especially a thorough acquaintance with the depth of the ocean, because both continents, having born races instructed by divine masters, were each transferred to the bottom of the seas, where they now slumber until the appointed time shall come to reappear above the waters. And as both Lemuria, destroyed by submarine fires, and Atlantis, submerged by the waves, perished in the ocean depths, Atlas is said to have been compelled to leave the surface of the earth and join his father Japetus in the depths of Tartarus. Atlas then personifies a continent in the west said to support heaven and earth at once. That is, the feet of the giants tread the earth while his shoulders support the sky, an allusion to the gigantic peaks of the ancient continents, Mount Atlas and the Tenerife Peak. These two dwarfed relics of the two lost continents were thrice as lofty during the day of Lemuria and twice as high in that of Atlantis. Atlas was an inaccessible island's peak in the days of Lemuria when the African continent had not yet been raised. Lemuria should no more be confounded with the Atlantis continent than Europe with America. Both sank, both were drowned with their high civilizations and gods, quote-unquote, yet between the two catastrophes a period of about 700,000 years elapsed. Why should not your geologists bear in mind that under the continents explored and fathomed by them, in the bowels of which they have found the Eocene age, there may be hidden deep in the unfathomable oceans other and far older continents whose strata have never been geologically explored, and that they may some day upset their present theories." Unquote. Amazed at the singular corroboration of what my friend had previously read, I concluded I would ask him something more about it at the first opportunity, not dreaming that the opportunity of lives was close at hand. During all this time, we had been making good time towards the south. Both officers and men had been attracted towards our passenger, and all were ready to give him a little attentions which make a stranger feel at home anywhere. I mention this as an explanatory of some events which happened a little later. The winds had been brisk and favorable, but as we approached the Spanish Main, they grew fitful, and when we traversed a part of that West Indian archipelago, they fell away into a dead calm. Our ship drifted a little to the south, but made no particular headway. On the third day, the moon lolled at noon, and we were lying in about 30 degrees north latitude and 42 degrees west longitude, when my friend asked me if I would like to go with him to visit a peculiar looking island about a couple of miles to the westward. Upon my rather eager assent, the captain granted us the use of his yawl, and though he proffered us the help of some of the crew, our friend declined, saying he had been much accustomed to the water. We pushed off, I taking a pair of oars and he steering, and I hardly had taken a couple strokes with the oars when I felt that the rapid impulsion of the boat was not due to my strength. I glanced at my companion. His face was set with a peculiar expression of which I had before had experience in other directions. A very short time sufficed to bring us to this island, which on closer inspection seemed to be the summit of some huge obelisk or pillar, a little raised above the waves. The sides, although not high, were sheer and precipitous. In the still waters they extended below the surface as far as vision could penetrate. How much farther I had no means of ascertaining. We rowed slowly around it. It was about 150 meters in circumference. On the side farthest from the vessel, the face of the rock was broken jaggedly by the weather. The projections gave opportunity for fastening the yawl and for climbing into the summit. If there had been any swell in the ocean, even this would have been impossible, but with the sea of glass all about us, it was not a very difficult task. Having securely knotted the boat's painter to a stout protuberance, we scrambled as best we might to the top. To my utter surprise, instead of the flat, solid mass roughened by the weather, which I expected to find, it was cup-shaped in the center, evidently filling with water during storms and drying out under the hot sun. It was now dry at the bottom. Looking closely at the sides, I saw that instead of being a mass of natural rock, it was a structure built of masonry by cunning hands, so perfectly and solidly as to defy thus far the fierce action of the most erosive forces of nature. The floor was laid in regular flagging. Almost stunned by the discovery, I turned to my companion, but my exclamation of surprise was checked by his action. Standing erect in the very center with his face to the north, guiding himself by a small compass and a little square of parchment upon which characters were inscribed, he turned 15 degrees to the east and stepped forward one pace. Then, turning 15 degrees more, he stepped forward another pace. He repeated this operation until he faced due east. There, standing erect, his form seemed to dilate, and his face grew fixed and set in its whole outline. All at once I perceived a large disk of stone that revolved at his feet, exposing a flight of stone steps leading into a room below. Coming back to myself, he motioned me to follow him, and slowly we descended the stairs into an anteroom below, opened into a larger room. As we stepped upon this floor, a light which came from nowhere in particular lighted up the whole interior. Limitless age had laid this desecrating hand upon everything, but as this had been hermetically sealed by the waves, the dust that would otherwise have accumulated in the upper air was not present. In the center of the room were 5 stone seats. On each was a pile of dust. My companion, still silent, stepped to the east, and facing the seats made one of the signs of power. As he did so, I thought I heard a suppressed sob of joy, but it was not distinct enough to be unmistakable. Then, going to the exact opposite of the side of the wall, which was partitioned to a series of curious entablatures, he touched some mechanism which, preserved through the ages, obeyed the will of this wonderful man. A door slid back, through which we passed into a chamber below. Here we found 7 seats. On each rested those curious little piles of dust. My friend repeated the sign made in the room above, and then a sound like a tremor of an Aeolian harp rose in volume until the vibration filling the room shook the walls of the tower in which we were standing. Turning to the eastern face of the wall, from a niche therein he drew out a little stone box. Holding this carefully, he retraced his steps towards the upper air, closely followed by myself. With the greatest care he closed behind him every avenue, thus sealing once more for future unfolding whatever might be of the knowledge or mystery here concealed. When the disc at the top had rolled into its place, a roll of pigment was placed in his hand by unseen helpers. With this he traced upon the tightly joined edges a character which burst into a silvery flame as it appeared upon the stone, and left a blood-red mark behind it. Then, proceeding to the side where the boat lay waiting for us, we managed without any difficulty to seat ourselves in it and push off, he steering as before. Singular as it may seem, without any preconcerted instruction or word or warning, Not a word had been interchanged between us from the moment of our landing until we were again in motion upon the water. On my part, the silence was involuntary. I seemed to stand in a vortex of recurring memory, coming down, overwhelming me upon me. I was too busy within myself in attempting to readjust the past, the present, and the promises of the future to leave any time for the frivolity of speech. I could not resist the feeling that these rock-ribbed chambers were, in some peculiar way, a part of myself. I knew I had been perfectly familiar with the purposes of their erection and their use, and of some final issue, appalling and benumbing in its effect. More than that, the 5 seats of the upper chamber and the 7 seats of the lower, into my inner vision, were filled with occupants shadowy, but so distinct I could recognize the features as one recalls the lineaments of a long absent friend. Then came the names as if I had parted with them only yesterday. O memory the eternal! Was it yesterday or thousands of years ago since I looked upon these faces and forms of comrades loving and true? The feeling of present reality of some tie stronger than friendship overwhelmed me. When my friend made the sign I mentioned, a burden of untold weight was lifted upon my shoulders. As if an expiation were finished, a terrible mistake rectified, whose consequence all my life up to that hour had cramped and restrained all my unfolding in its energies. All this and much more that words will utterly fail to portray held me silent as my friend did what he evidently came to do, taking me as an involuntary accomplice. Sitting in the stern of the boat, facing me with a stone casket resting on his knees, he looked at me with a grave smile and said, "My brother, I see my confidence in thee was not founded in simple assumption but in knowledge. Thou hast learned well the lessons whose closing clause is to keep silent. Thereby thou hast proved also thy position in the great brotherhood, whose first character was issued by the Atlantean kings. I greet thee, ancient wise one." Unquote. While saying this, his whole face lighted up as if from an inner fire. The action of the sympathetic exultation on myself was beyond the power of words to describe. It was as if one had suddenly come to a perception of almost infinite power, and without a particle of arrogance in the possession, I could only reply, quote, "I feel that we must have been brothers, but you do me great honor in naming me thus." "Before we reach the ship, I must tell you," continued my comrade, "that it has been permitted for you before I reached the ship, I must Before we reach the ship, I must tell you," continued my comrade, "that it has been permitted you, for purpose, to revisit the tower of the great temple of Atlantis, in which were gathered for concentration during the last awful cataclysm which sent the continent beneath the waters, all the living members of the most potent brotherhood that ever existed. You entered the chambers of the 3, the 5, and the 7. The whole continent is slowly rising once more. The top of the tower, which was 100 feet in diameter at the base and 210 feet high, has again reached the upper air. The transparent dome which covered the chamber of the 3 has been destroyed by the action of the waves. We do not know whether the masonry of the upper stories will be able to resist the erosion of the fierce tropical storms or not, as little by little it reaches the surface. It was thought best by the Brotherhood to rescue this," and unquote. Here he touched the little casket, and back to his quote, "before it might be overwhelmed and forever hidden by the insatiable maw of the waters. It contains the fullest continuous record of the last years of our once glorious country, at present accessible. The chambers which we entered were built perfectly air and watertight, and for that reason we have preserved their contents to the present time. Below the last chamber we entered was that of the 15, and still below that the chamber of the 45. I did not enter them, for I was warned that I might thereby afford opportunity for the waters pressing up from below to wipe out all the vestiges of this ancient home of the Brotherhood, which to later generations may be ocular demonstration of our existence. Obligation rested heavily on the 3 and the 5 and the 7. They could not be set free entirely from its responsibility until such time as either the bounds were destroyed, as in the upper chamber, or one clothed with authority entered their resting place should give them their signal of release, which I did. Below the 7, the failure of conditions above absolved the members of the remaining chambers, and they were set free in a very short time after the cataclysm. You are well known to me as to the rest of the ancient brotherhood, and have been chosen again, as in the long ago past, to be a spokesman of our beloved order in its newest appeal to mankind, and we are sure that mistakes of the intellect in the past will not be repeated in the present, but we are approaching the ship, the most important objects of our voyage. The possession of these records, which no person living or dead could obtain without your actual presence in the flesh, is accomplished. The voyage was planned and undertaken for this purpose and will result as planned. Our vessel has been lying over the entrance of the great port at the mouth draining the Atlantean continent, from which, before the overthrow, a magnificent panorama of the fairest land the sun ever shone on was visible. We could not accomplish our object until near the full moon, so the calm has lasted until this time. But tonight, as the sun goes down, a breeze will spring up, and by tomorrow, our voyage would be moving rapidly forward to its completion. Unquote. It did not occur to me during all this recital to object either to the facts stated or to the certain quiet assumption of myself as one of the willing accessories of the plan he had thus hastily sketched. It seemed quite a matter of course that the sole object of my making this voyage was the accomplishment of what I now with mortal ears for the first time heard. Nay, more, I felt a certain enthusiasm, a quiet joy of being thus permitted to do the task, whatever it might be that was set for me as an integral factor of the whole to complete. I know that this is not at all the thing likely to happen, according to deduction from what we know of human nature. But as this story is one of facts on new lines, we cannot be guided by precedents or the working of known laws, as we seek rather in the fields of the unexplained laws of nature for a solution of the phenomena presented. But we were now close to the ship, and the men were making ready to hoist the yawl aboard. As we reached the deck, my friend showed his casket as a curious souvenir of the stone pile we had visited. After looking at it casually, they assented to the fact, quote, it was a nice bit of rock, looks like a trifle water-worn, though, unquote. And so knowledge of the incalculable value passed beyond their reach forever, or at least until the refiner's furnace of the ages shall have prepared them more fully for the perception of that which may at any time be offered to them. Yeah, well, I'm plowing right through this book, aren't I? All right, I got to take one more really just quick small break. Okay, guys. I'm going to check my stove to make sure it's nice and hot. And I'll be actually, guys, I'm going to have to wrap it up today. So I apologize for cutting it off here. But pretty interesting stuff so far, I think, you know. I don't really know what to make of it, but it's very interesting. And then in these next couple of chapters, we're going to get into what is supposedly on these records of Atlantis. It's a very fantastic story. Believe it if you will. I thought it was kind of interesting, and it certainly matches a little bit with some of the hermetic type of stuff and the emerald tablets of Thoth and things like that. So I don't know, you know, I thought it was an interesting book, especially for Atlantis kind of thing, and who knows if this is all true, but I think it's still worth reading out. So what I'll do is I'm going to come back and do another reading, and then we'll just I'll probably just plow through the whole rest of the book, and so we'll just make this 2 videos instead of like the Philosophy of Fire, which took me like 3 times. 3 or actually 6 videos to complete. As you can see, the text here is a little bit easier, so it doesn't take as long. Either way, I very much appreciate you guys joining me today, and I will, if you like the video, hit the like button, you know, subscribe, share if you think other people would be interested in listening to this book, and I will be back with part 2 either tomorrow or the next day, but part 2 will be up pretty soon. And I'm not really going to put any analysis into this book. I just thought it was kind of a cool, interesting book to read as far as the ancient past and what these people have to say. So, and like I said, I'm going to push back on his Native American comments in the beginning, because I think that's kind of stupid and ignorant of him. But not all people have all, I would say I'm not going to say stupid. It was ignorant because he doesn't understand. He doesn't know some of the stuff I've obviously been coming across, and that makes perfect sense. When we don't know stuff, then we are ignorant to certain things, and you're gonna have to kind of like forgive people for that kind of stuff because not everybody's gonna be able to know everything. Obviously, there's not enough time in life to know quote unquote everything. So, what is the most important things to know? I think is really kind of the point. Anyways, I'll be back. I'll see you guys later. Peace.